Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in political philosophy. We are still looking at various different ideological traditions that exist within basic political theory. Just like with our studies of anything, really, we need to essentially create something of a foundation from which political philosophy is done. And there is obviously a debate that is had about whether or not you can do political philosophy outside the lens of ideology and outside the lens of political thought, like as in political theories and political ideas. And so, as a result of which, of course, it is important that we spend some time talking about these ideas and these ideologies and the ways in which liberals, conservatives, and socialists look at and approach these different essentially political questions, before actually looking at what those political questions actually are. So, this lesson is going to talk about liberalism and its relationship with economic theory. We will spend some time talking about some of the major economic policies which are commonly described as being part of the broader corpus of liberalism. So what does liberal economics actually look like? We looked in the previous lesson at what and how liberals and how basic classical liberalism and liberal ideas deals with things like the social aspects and the ways in which they interact with things like the state of nature and the debate that is then given rise to in relation to Thomas Hobbes on the one hand, and then you have individuals like John Locke on the other hand. Obviously, Thomas Hobbes is not a liberal, but Thomas Hobbes presents quite a negative conceptualization of what essentially the state of nature would look like, whereas John Locke takes a much more positive approach, as we see. When it comes to economics, the approaches that we've already listed relating to things like human nature, and then by extension things like society, these two ideas very much closely inform the approaches that can be had in relation to economics and to the economy. Because essentially liberals believe that property is a fundamental natural right, liberal economic policies, clearly as a result of that, will place front and centre the idea of private property and ownership of private property in their reasoning. So that's just one example of how basic human nature, basic understandings of society extends to beliefs about the fundamental rights to property, and how this fundamental right to property then informs the basis for and the center of reasoning for when we talk about economics. So, as a result of this, you would generally come to the conclusion that liberals support a form of capitalism. So liberals are strongly associated with principles of private enterprise and private ownership of the means of production, which is the sort of disparity in the distinction that we make in political philosophy between the capitalists and communists or socialists is the ownership of the means of production, the collective ownership of means of production versus the private ownership of the means of production in an owner class. Now, of course, there's a lot more theory and a lot more ideas that sort of tie into and are baked into that basic principle. When we look at Marxism and when we look at socialism in more detail in future lessons' time, I'm sure we will get to this in more specifically. But now, it should just be noted that liberalism has been strongly associated with this idea of private enterprise as well as private capital and private ownership. But with that being said, some actually describe the concept of capitalism as one of the economic liberalisms. And what this essentially does is detach and sets apart liberalism on the one hand from socialism on the other, since one of the core tenets of socialist theory is a standing in contrast to, and therefore a critique of, capitalism. That's what socialism essentially does. Now, the extent to which you can sort of make arguments for the interrelationship between state ownership and private ownership, and how you can sort of have sort of socialist elements within a capitalist economy, is obviously one for the theorists of socialism and democratic socialism and social democracy and all these different kinds of political ideas. Some argue that you can't have that situation, that what you represent there is not truly socialism. Some argue that you can have sort of socialist ideas that are imbued in capitalism and vice versa. Again, these are all things that we will probably get to in future lessons' time. Now, classical liberalism tends to focus its attention on the existence of what are known as free markets. Now, we know what a market is. A market is simply a place where people buy and sell goods or services. Now, the idea of a free market is the idea of a market not where the things are free, but where it is free from constraint. Free from constraint, usually from that of the state. The state doesn't impose obligations or restrictions on markets. That's what the idea of the free market is. And the idea here is that there are various different principles and different laws of market economics. So things like supply and demand, things like the influence of price and price elasticity, and all of these different kinds of things. And free market capitalists argue that the free market itself and the laws of the free market, the laws of demand and supply and elasticity and market equilibrium, are all that you need to essentially allocate resources in a way that is fair and equitable, such that you don't need to have the state intervening in the market and imposing subsidies or taxations or restrictions and all these different kinds of things. If you just let the market be free and do what it does, then that can lead to economic prosperity, essentially. Now, one of the founding thinkers of this idea is the capitalist economist, Adam Smith, who argues that if obstacles to free trade are removed, the, quote, invisible hand of the market will force and guide traders to success. So, what Adam Smith is describing here in the, quote, invisible hand of the market is these basic laws and principles that I've just mentioned, the idea of supply and demand and elasticity and market equilibrium. These are what he describes as the, quote, invisible hand of the market, because they are just the sort of ways in which humans interact with the market and the ways in which resources are allocated and how prices are assigned, etc., etc. Now, with that being said, there are lots of actual ways in which liberal economics can be represented, and that's because capitalism exists in a variety of different forms. So classical liberals probably would disagree with modern liberals about what the economy should look like, because classical liberals take a far more conservative now approach to the ways in which capitalism operates. Free market capitalism and sort of neoliberalism and these kind of things are far more associated with more right-wing, more conservative political parties and political politicians. Adam Smith advocated for a system of economics that was similar to the kind of economics that we see by politicians and leaders such as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, this idea known as the trickle-down system of economics, whereby if you were to reduce quantitative restrictions on trade, this would lead to wealth being trickled down to the rest of society. Now, the ways in which Ronald Reagan devised this kind of idea in terms of Reaganomics was in relation to taxation policy. Essentially, Reaganomics and the idea of neoliberal trickle-down economics within the Reagan administration advocates for this idea that if we were to reduce taxation to the richest people within society such that they had more money, then they would have more money to spend, and therefore that money would then start to trickle down and have economic benefits to the rest of society. Now, the ways in which that is incorrect is obviously in relation to the fact that money gets transmitted and gets essentially goes through a society much more when you give tax breaks and you give money to people who need it most rather than people who need it the least, because the people who need it the least will spend more time saving that revenue rather than spending that revenue on average. So it leads to actually a failed system fundamentally. But equally speaking, and equally in this regard, a liberal economic policy could advocate for the existence of markets, but with some restrictions. So some of the sort of social democrat thinkers of today and the sort of liberal and quite progressive ideas that exist within economics today accept the existence of markets, accepts the existence of capitalism, but maybe accepts the existence of capitalism with some restrictions. The idea that the state should be able to intervene in order to ensure distributive justice, whether this be through the existence of a welfare state that taxes the wealthiest in society and then uses that revenue to essentially distribute that out to the masses, to those who need it in welfare, whether that be welfare through the existence of a public funded healthcare system or through a universal basic income, or any of these different kinds of things. They still exist within basic capitalist society, but they ensure this existence of and this idea known as distributive justice within society, something that we will get to in future lessons time, I'm sure.